Strange experience seeing again a play that you, 5 years ago, directed.
Very, very strange, for a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, sitting in somebody else's rehearsal is a strange experience. However welcoming people have been, you can't help but feel you're imposing, because a rehearsal is a kind of private space where people can make mistakes and make jokes and laugh, and then this kind of stranger. It always makes people feel awkward. It certainly made me feel awkward at first, but more interestingly is the way in which I was watching the scenes unfold and being created that, as you say, 5 years ago I'd worked on. And we know that the scripts are practically the same, slight cuts and edits here and there, but practically the same. And yet our approaches are so diverse. For a start, you're working with an undergraduate cast of men and women. I was working with an all-boy cast, aged between, I think, 12 and 17 was the oldest. And so that throws up so many differences immediately, apart from the interpretive differences. And there were some, and of course the delight is there's neither right nor wrong, it's different choices you make. So I found myself fascinated, puzzled, enthralled, amused, outraged at times, all of these things going on, and then trying to make valid contributions. I failed in the last one, but so it's been a quiet but exhausting day for me. I don't expect pity.
You will not be given that. You always work with, well, almost always work with all-male company.
Yeah.
What distinctively happens in a Marston play, working with an all-male company, because you've done a range of playwrights.
Yeah. Although as you're quite right, in the last 8 years or so, it's been pretty exclusively with these all-boy companies. And the first thing one notices working on these boys' company plays is a very, very strong sense that the playwrights knew exactly what they were doing, that it was not like a second best choice. We couldn't get the King's Men. We'd love them, but actually we'd just go with a group of boys instead. They were writing, Marston particularly writing for a boys' company to exploit what the boys could offer. And so one of those things would be a certain degree of verbal dexterity and felicity. Highly trained choir boys and so on, used to performing difficult bits of text. So there you go with this play, you've got plenty of difficult bits of text with all sorts of virtuosic possibilities, disguise, accents, unusual and in some places made up words, different languages, shall we go on? So all sorts of verbal challenges and theatrical challenges which performing boys respond to very well, I think. So that's one of the things. The other is this disputing this legal background in Marston. Obviously a trained lawyer himself, who then apparently, to his father's outrage, turned his back on the law and went in with the Theatre Times. But you can see it through practically every major speech, and sometimes in the short speeches, this sense of either on the one hand there's this and there's that. More often I'm going to occupy a ridiculous position and I'm going to defend it logically, and you are going to have to listen. And even when you try and answer back, I will try and top it. Now, although that's lawyers' training, I think we all know that that's very close to the kind of curriculum that Elizabethan schoolboys would have gone through as well, that disputation, that debating, that ability to take on a character's position and argue it through, even if it's ridiculous. Our boys responded very well to that as well, and I think there's that competitive element between a bunch of boys together. It's almost like the text becomes a ball and you throw it in the middle of the rehearsal space and they start playing around with it, and then somebody gets quite good with the ball, so somebody else tries something special, and that kind of banter, that competitive bouncing off one another, was something that came out of rehearsals, and I'd argue it's there within the text, and that's why the boys responded so well to it. So I think there are those elements. When we did the play, it was one of the first boys' companies plays that we'd done. And I think for most members of the audience, the most striking thing, first of all, was, oh look, boys are playing girls. Because the tradition in the school before, and the plays that I'd done, we'd work with our sister grammar school, and girls had come across for our plays, and boys would go across for their plays, and so on. And suddenly we had boys dressing up as women, as girls, as prostitutes, and so on. So I think it was very much in the air at first. What's it going to be like? That's something I'm sure Marston and the other playwrights, but Marston exploits and plays on. Not simply for a kind of sensational appeal, and I'm not, as my reading of the academics isn't great, but I think that there was a sense that really the appeal of these boys' companies at first was largely parodic. It was that they were young boys aping the proper actors and big emotions, and so the result on the whole would have to be some sort of parody or satire, and that was it. What we found working through it is, first of all, after the initial shock, it didn't matter a damn that it was a boy playing a girl. Mm-hmm. The boy isn't an adult male either. He isn't a vintner. He isn't in a different play a king or a warrior. You know, it's all about acting. So you're just playing a part. You play the part well. Find out what you're saying, and say it with conviction, and accompany it with the right kind of gestures, and you're telling a story. And so that's what we found, that people initially were a bit shocked, and the very first performance at school with groups of parents sitting around, there were gasps when the first prostitute characters came on. But after 10 minutes, it started to not be that. It wasn't giggling at that aspect. It was giggling at the wit of the characters, and it was silences at what they were saying to each other and trying to follow the text. So I think that what Marston is brilliant at doing is unfolding the characters in those situations, in those challenges and struggles and competitions between each other, with brilliant, glittering language. And that's what we did with boys.
The play travels. I know you did up to
Yeah,
the end
yeah,
of
yeah.
Free Scene 1, but that's
Scene one,
already
yeah,
quite a distance. Its mood swings, its stylistic transformations are massive.
Extraordinary.
How about negotiating those?
Yes, the answer was that we just decided to play each scene on its merits and allow the audience to try to make sense of it, if that's what it is. I don't think it is a smoothly developing play at all. Most of these plays from this period aren't. And this busts out the sides all over the place. And there are scenes of hilarity, there are scenes of outrage and disgust, there are scenes where you really have to listen hard. So yeah, all of those stylistic varieties we tried to encapsulate. One of the delights of the play as well is that Marston was writing for boys that he knew were also talented musicians. So there's plenty of opportunity for music in several of these plays, and particularly in Dutch Courtesan. And just as you find in the best playwrights, the songs are not there as fillers. You know, they advance the dramatic action, the psychological action as well. So we had great fun in trying to find the right kind of style for that. As you're aware, we decided to set our production in the 1920s with a kind of sort of Flapper and Hooray Henry, Jeeves and Worcester, that sort of world of young men who, if they weren't at the Inns of Court, would have been at Oxford and Cambridge and drinking too much and misbehaving and going off with prostitutes and so on. And that allowed us, of course, to go for that sort of jazz age music in terms of selling that performance aspect.
There's one character who, I only became aware of this as we did pre-production. There's one character who loves music, and unexpectedly it's Maligra. It's the Puritan figure who, in his moments of distress, constantly calls for music, and effectively is put in the position, therefore, of the person who cues the interactive music in the theatre. But you might expect it would be one of the gallants, or So in a way, he's got the music on his side. We have to experiment with that yet, but it's really intriguing.
That is an interesting point. We didn't go for the interact music. We didn't use it in the same way, but I can see what you mean.
It accumulates onwards because you only did one of the scenes where he calls for music. It happens more later, but
that in itself is typical of Marston, isn't it? He would take the character you'd least expect and have him.
He's perverse.
He's got a musical soul, and as you say, Marston's perverse. He kind of, whenever you feel you know where you are with him or with a character, something happens and it changes, and that's hard for an audience. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why perhaps these plays are not done as often.
The premise of what you said is that you think by this stage it's not parody any longer. I mean, there is parody in there, but the play itself is not predominantly parodic. It's into much darker. People get damaged here, and you're meant to take that quite seriously.
I absolutely agree with that. Whether we achieved it or not, what we were aiming to do was tell a really good story with complete conviction. There might be humour and so forth in there, but as we know, that only intensifies the mix. So,
you take it quite far in one scene with Freeville's treatment of the title character.
That's right. It sums it up very well with the kind of wrong footing. Freeville oozes charm, and it's one of the challenges for the actor to get the audience on his side when he's behaving, I would say, quite abominably. Both in his treatment of course, Francescina, and the way he uses and abuses and speaks about her and tries to pass her on, but also poor Beatrice, and she is also weak and in a terrible position, just like Francescina, but if you like, at the other end of the spectrum in terms of the roles available to women, perhaps. And Freeville's there in the middle, sort of manipulating and playing both off. And that's appalling. And when we got to the scene that I think you're referring to, where Francescina has heard that Freeville's going off with Beatrice, he's going to get married, he's going to move into the right kind of social status and all of those things with Sir Herbert Subboy's daughter, and notices the engagement ring, she goes off completely and loses it. And we've seen the anger in Francescina in earlier scenes, and indeed in the earlier bit of that scene, but in our production, she absolutely latched on to his hand and the ring and was trying to drag it off, and of course it wouldn't come off. And there was a moment where we were able to have two lads, one was 16, one was 17, struggling on stage. And both said, in a way, if one of them had been a girl, then that struggle, obviously we would have arranged some sort of stage fight in a different way, but there couldn't have been the sheer physical effort. Whether that's a sexist statement or not is what the boys felt, and they really went for it. So one was trying to get the ring off, and the other, the lines seem beautifully written to express this, actually struck her and cast her to the floor at one point. And the audience, having been used to at first laughing at Francescina because it's Harry dressed as a girl, and the funny accent and the innuendos, and laughing at Freeville because he's such a sort of charming character and doing all these things, there was a real slap in the face. It wasn't the first time that the audience went quiet, but the cliched pin drop. And she pulled herself up to her full height, slowly, and with great dignity uttered that I am you do not love me. Heartbreaking. Something came out of that because it was boys doing it. And the other thing as a teacher, which is what I am in my proper job, is the educational value of boys doing these plays, and particularly with regard to the subject matter. We're in an all-boys school, and of course they have their PSHE lessons and so on. But it was really interesting to get the boys talking about attitudes towards women, attitudes towards prostitution, things that normally 14-year-old boys are not encouraged to talk about. But it comes up in rehearsals, and boys said things like, to the boy playing Freeville, I really hated you today in rehearsal because of the way you were talking about women. And what choices, the scene we saw you rehearse this afternoon, what hope is there for my body? I must turn Turk for tuppence. Now she's in a and that was a very gratifying element for me, aside from the fact that we were putting the show on. But boys were able to talk about this sorts of things.
You presumably deliberately went at least as far as 3-1 in order to get Chris Manella in?
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. I was only given half an hour first of all, and we squeezed some more in.
Because there is this extraordinary situation that he holds back the lead character, who is completely unlike all the other women, and releases her only, whatever that is, 14 minutes into the show, and she comes in saying, no, this is how we do it.
Yes. In some ways I feel Chris Manella is the most fascinating character in the entire play. She's extraordinary. It was only after we decided that we would set it in the 1920s that it occurred to us that we could play her as a blue stocking.
In a suit.
In a suit. And it was very interesting. A colleague of mine, who is head of classics at the school, saw the performance, the very first performance, and she came up and said afterwards, explain to me why Chris Manella, that's a woman, isn't it? Yes. Well, why dress in a suit? And I made my explanation. She said, oh, I get it. Now, that's not to say that, okay, I got it right. I was being clever there. It seemed to us obvious that young, intellectual, vibrant woman would be a leading intellectual in the Blue Stocking Brigade, and she'd dress in a suit and she'd smoke with a cigarette holder, and she had a monocle. It was a challenge to the men. Now, of course, it became a challenge to the audience, because there was an audience trying to work out, well, those boys are playing girls.
He's mixed us up enough, and now he's doing this to us.
I know, and I'm still quite pleased with that decision, because I thought it was a very Marstonian decision to trick the audience still further. Although I do know, a very generous review was written of the performance we gave at the Globe, but it was something that was criticised as being stylistically incorrect. But I'd point to several other academics who say, never mind, it really worked. So,
yes.
You pay your money, you take your choice. These plays are all about risk, aren't they? If you want to play something safe, there's plenty of other maybe nice modern safe comedies. So this is about risk, and we did with that. But I would justify it on textual grounds.
I know you didn't go the full distance, but have you thought through how Chris Manella's story ends? She, in the middle line, she dwindles into marriage, or what happens?
Yeah.
We're still working it out.
Yeah, well, right. When we performed it first, at the end, there was a kind of, it's like people who run to the edge of a cliff. Well, what? We want to find out what happens to Franceschina in particular, they wanted to know. But what happens to the rest? And actually, I hadn't encouraged the cast to read further on in the play. They didn't know, so they were performing it as they thought it should be. I have to say, in some ways, I think it becomes a much more tricky play as it carries on. I think the character of Franceschina, which is fascinating up until round about the middle of Act 3, in some ways does dwindle, to use your word. And Chris Manella, I think something similar happens to that. It kind of doesn't fall apart at all, but from this point, if you want, I would say that Marston offers a very cynical view towards the end of the play, of the way people fit into their conventional roles, and everyone is roughly patted on the head, and it's all fine, apart from Franceschina, who gets sent off to be whipped. And remind me what happens to Maligra at the end.
Well, he's reprieved. It's the state of mind he's in that's the performance choice.
That's right, yes, because there's that great joke, isn't there? You were saying from Mistress Maligra,
Yes,
right
yes.
at the end.
So we're still working that out.
Yeah,
We think he doesn't repent. We think he. I'm trying not to go too far and take away audience surprise. But
of course.
But we think he finally knows who Cordenr is, and does a plea bargain.
Right.
In effect, and he says, "I forgive, as I would be forgiven. Know ye one Cordenr?" To Cordenr.
Yeah.
It seems to me that man is not, as Marston's created him, someone who will actually unmake himself and say, "I was wrong."
No,
he's rooted in a particular identity. So he goes through the form of penance. In order to survive. So that's how we're experimenting at the moment. But we have a fortnight to go. So all bets might be off in the end. But with Manella, lots of people feel she dwindles, and there's a moment in the last scene that we are exploring where she has no dialogue, but she wins over Tysophue, who has no dialogue. It's like the moment I got rather obsessed with in the last scene of Mad World, where the harebrained plot falls apart because well, in this one Tysophue ends the penultimate scene thinking that Beatrice has gone mad because she's going to the execution with a pimp.
Right.
He actually freaks out about it and says women, and then it's actually very caustic, and Manella takes him more or less by the ear and says premature judgments leave people looking very foolish. And so he's on stage in the last scene when the reveal comes as to who the pander is. And I think there's a beat there, a silent beat that Marston's written. We haven't found how to do it yet. No. But she turns and says, "This is an example of the mistakes you make in life. So before we're married." So Marston certainly puts Tysophue through a series of pratfalls that the play doesn't actually need just for narrative. So much is going on, however, in that last scene that actually finding the right focus for that amidst the other things that are occurring is technically quite difficult, and we haven't solved that yet. So we'll see where we are between now and then. But I feel more and more that this is an absolutely brilliantly planned play. And plotted in a way that the criticism doesn't begin to get near. And I think that even the dwindling that you're describing with the Dutch courtesan herself is actually a plotted dwindling, because she's got a consciousness inside her and dwindling, if you see what I mean, of the fact that she's been driven to become the thing that Freeville will hate. And her emotions take her that way. And she can't stop it, but she does know that it's happening. We'll see how we play the end. We'll go through many versions yet. But do you reckon with Freeville, for example, we both have a negative version on him? Do you think that's us, or is that the play?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because I was chatting to your actor playing Freeville when you were concentrating on another bit of the rehearsal. We were talking about the character, and he was asking me about my dislike, and we were talking about this kind of empty-heartedness and so on. And then in the conversation we started to talk about the way in which actually Freeville is in some ways his own worst enemy, because people do just fall down before him, both women and probably men. They let him get away with too much. He's been used to getting away with things throughout his life. And so in some ways you start, in that conversation I started to see him as a victim. He doesn't know how, he's not mature enough. He's supposed to be a young man. He's not mature enough, and I began to sort of question my own view. I think it's probably, sorry, go on. No, I think it's probably something about us bringing our judgments into the play.
Because the scholarship absolutely divides between people who presume that effectively you've got, in however variant of form, morality play structure, and finally there is a force of good, and that's Freeville, and he is free will. He liberates himself from sensual enslavement. And there's an absolute opposite camp that presumes that slowly it is the prosecution counsel case. About Freeville, there is a tendency on both sides to state it, not to demonstrate it, and certainly not performatively to prove it. My instinct at the moment is that it's a brilliant account of a guy who is deeply, deeply unstable and is trying to force himself into a fixity that he actually can't stay with. I think that is there as a story. What degree of detachment from that as a phenomenon Marston's got, I don't know. I don't know.
You know, in the end, what he does as a playwright is present that difficulty brilliantly.
And then what he does at the end is the story. Another play would end with Freeville.
Yeah.
And this one brings Freeville's story to an end about 10 minutes before the end of the play, and then the other story takes over. Sorry, Freeville, you weren't the lead after all. You saw that little encounter between Cordenr and Freeville. Cordenr wins that in the end because the play becomes his and he speaks at the end of half of the play.
And you're going to have him
do the prologue as well. So he's going to get raps on it.
Yeah. he has a power that's unlike the other characters, I think.
Well, he can play any game.
Yeah, master at it.
And it seems to be quite insane.
Yeah. And what Marston is able to present is...
1 minute, maybe.
No. Well, what Marston was able to present, I think, is psychology in a very vivid theatrical way.
Yes.
And, you know, with other people, if it were Shakespeare, we'd say, isn't that brilliant insight?
Yes.
But sometimes with other playwrighs, I think, well, he can't quite have been in control in that way.
Yeah.
He was very radical in the way he structures plays, and as you say, with this one, provides a second half that you didn't quite expect. Well, why not? You know, he was breaking new ground.
Mm.